The impulse started much longer ago than 10 years because I've always enjoyed Russia. I'm a great fan of Russian classical music, people like Prokofiev and Shostakovich and the like. So I came to St. Petersburg and Moscow in Soviet times, but as you know, at that time it was very difficult to travel outside of those cities, so I was always wanting to travel outside Moscow and St. Petersburg and see the countryside, because I'd read Turgenev and I'd read Tolstoy. So when with the breakup of the Soviet Union, the opportunity arose to travel in the countryside. So in many ways I was looking for an excuse to travel in Russia. And I came across some postcards by Bilibin, which had been produced at the beginning of the 20th century, and he'd travelled in northern Russia in 1902 and 1903 and 1904, and I realised that if I set off in 2002, I would be travelling in his footsteps 100 years. After Levitan's, the most famous picture of wooden churches, of course, Levitan's Above Eternal Peace, but there is an equally famous image of the bell tower at Tzvoziro by Bilibin, and there's a very beautiful postcard. That was one of the first postcards I saw, and it's also the second wooden church building I saw on my first trip. The first one was at Verkhanya Uftyuga, near Kotlas, and then just after that we went to Tzvoziro. So it's an important cultural relic as far as Russia is concerned. And because some people in England had shown an interest in trying to restore a wooden building, I thought that the bell tower at Tzvoziro would be a very good one to start with. When I first started the project, I had no idea about saving wooden churches or even producing a book. I was just looking for a way of travelling in the Russian countryside, which I couldn't do before the breakup of the Soviet Union. So I had no great mission. And in a way, I still have no great mission, but I've discovered that more Russian people have become a lot of Russian people have become interested in the churches, and whereas before there was very little happening, now there's a lot happening, and there are lots of Russians who are going around trying to preserve the churches and working very hard. So I'm not trying to. All I'm doing is I'm trying to support those people because they're doing a brilliant job. In the afterword to the book, Mikhail Milchik says that maybe we will be the last generation that will see these churches, because they will all disappear. I'm more optimistic than that, because I think that there are people out there who are working very hard to try and preserve them. So I'm not doing anything myself as such. What I'm trying to do is support those people who are doing that work. But the interesting thing, of course, is that because this book has now been published, a lot more people know about these churches. There are people in England who didn't even realise that you had these beautiful objects. I work with architects, and the architects have been amazed by the quality of the buildings. And so have lots of people. The joy about the Russian wooden church in particular is that the construction is very simple. The churches are just constructed by laying one log on top of another horizontally. It's the technology of a wooden cabin, which we're all very familiar with, but it shows that even with a very simple technology, with imagination and in some cases genius, you can produce most extraordinary objects. Look at the church at Podporozhye is amazing. The church at Kizhi is extraordinary, but it's just using a very, very simple technology, and that's really what I love about it. Well, in fact, all the churches are special because there was a time when there would have been thousands of churches all over Russia. So every church that now exists is very special. It's each. The extraordinary thing about the churches is that they're not all the same style. Even within the few that are left, there are lots of different styles. So they're all special. But obviously there are favourites, and the church at Podporozhye, which is on the cover of the book, is a favourite church. Many Russian churches have been saved in special architectural parks in Russia. There's one at Archangel, there's one at Novgorod, another one at Vologda. But there's nothing like seeing a church in the place where it was meant to be, the place where it was built. And Podporozhye is in a particularly beautiful situation. You come across it on the road to Oniga, and you look across the Oniga River and you see the church of Podporozhye right on the horizon, and it looks absolutely amazing. If you took it down and put it down in a park with lots of other wooden architecture, it wouldn't be half as interesting. Its situation is extraordinary. So the first time we went there, we had to walk across the frozen river, and the river had been set out with little branches so that we could follow a path across the river. And then we climbed a snowy bank, and we arrived at the church, and it was extraordinary. The tragedy of Podporozhye is that the village has now disappeared. There are one or two people who live there in the summer, but nobody lives there for the whole year. So the church has no real congregation. So nobody is really interested in restoring it. And this is a problem. It's become an historic monument and doesn't have much use as a religious monument. But of course, it is a most extraordinary building, and it would be a great shame if it did disappear. Further down the river, there's the church of Techazevo on the way towards Kargopol, and that church does have a community. It's a very, very beautiful church, and it's on a huge scale. And when we first went there, maybe 5 years ago, there was one lady in the village who seemed to be interested in looking after the church. But now the community has got behind her, and other people within the community, and they are trying to restore the church. They don't actually have permission to restore the church. I think the church still belongs to the state. But they have been doing remedial work. They have been repairing the roof to stop the damp getting into the building. The problem with any wooden church is that once the damp gets into the joints, the churches collapse very, very quickly. So it's very important that there's continual work on the buildings, and they are looked after. They have to be cherished day by day. And the people of Techazevo have come together, and I think there are about 100 people in the village, and they are doing their best to look after the church. So that's one church that we'd really like to help the villagers, get behind the villagers and try and raise some money and try and get permission to restore that church, and also to restore the bell tower. There's a bell tower next door to the church. Before the revolution, there would have been a church every 10 to 15 kilometers all along the Oniga River, from Oniga to Kargopol. That's a lot of churches. And now maybe there are 5 or 10 churches along the river. And each of those communities would have had a bell tower, and each of those bell towers would have had a bell. So you can imagine there was a time when the whole river would have rung to the sound of bells, and now there isn't a bell to be heard along the river. So we thought that it would be a great symbol to try and put some bells back into the bell tower, so that the bells could then once again ring out across the river. Well, the way I've attracted attention is by producing this book. I'm not very proactive in other ways, but people see what I'm doing, and people, there are very nice booksellers in London who are working very hard to sell my book, and one of them has recommended it as a Christmas present. He said it's a beautiful book, etc., etc. And at the end he says, not interested in wooden churches, and then he says, you will be. And that's what's happened. You know, lots of people, some of my friends, they were saying, you know, what have you been doing? I'm a photographer, I'm not a writer, I don't give great speeches. I can only show in my photographs how beautiful these buildings are. And if you remember, when the Taliban destroyed the Buddhas at Bamiyan, we were all horrified. And we will be horrified if the Russian people let these wonderful churches disappear. I'm not saying that the Russian people are like the Taliban, but you know what I mean. It's terrible that something so beautiful should just be left to rot. It would be a great shame.